December 15th, 1944. The Ardennes forest in Belgium stretched endlessly under a blanket of snow 3 feet deep, its ancient trees standing like silent sentinels in the pre-dawn darkness. At exactly 4:30 in the morning, Corporal Marcus Washington of the 561st Transportation Company knelt in the frozen mud beside his supply truck, his breath forming crystalline clouds as he whispered prayers that his fellow soldiers had grown accustomed to hearing every morning for the past 18 months. The men of his racially segregated unit believed they knew what lay ahead that day. Another routine supply run through the quiet sector. Another day of hauling ammunition and rations to the front lines with little chance of seeing actual conflict. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What none of them could have imagined was that within 12 hours, this devout soldier's unwavering faith would become the difference between life and capture for every single man in their convoy, transforming the skeptics who had mocked his daily prayers into believers who would credit their survival to divine intervention, guided by the steady hands of a man they had once dismissed. The story begins 3 weeks earlier, on November 22nd, 1944, at a supply depot near Liège, Belgium, where the 561st Transportation Company had been stationed since the liberation of the city in September. The depot buzzed with constant activity as thousands of tons of supplies flowed through its warehouses daily, destined for the American forces pushing toward the German border. 26 trucks painted in olive drab formed neat rows between the wooden buildings, their canvas covers protecting precious cargo from the increasingly bitter weather. Marcus Washington stood apart from his fellow drivers, not by choice, but by the invisible barriers that segregation had built even within the ranks of those fighting for freedom. At 24 years old, he possessed a quiet dignity that commanded respect, though many of his white counterparts refused to acknowledge it. His dark skin bore the weathered lines of a man who had grown up working the cotton fields of rural Alabama before the conflict had swept him into the European theater. What set Marcus apart most visibly, however, was his leather-bound Bible, worn smooth from countless readings, which he carried in his left breast pocket and consulted every morning without fail. The morning routine never varied. While the other drivers stumbled from their bunks, grumbling about the cold and nursing hangovers from whatever liquor they had managed to procure the night before, Marcus would find a quiet corner of the motor pool and spend 20 minutes in silent prayer and scripture reading. His lips moved silently as he read passages from Psalms and Proverbs, seeking guidance for the day ahead and protection for his fellow soldiers, regardless of how they treated him. Private Tommy Kowalski, a 19-year-old from Detroit whose father worked the assembly lines at Ford Motor Company, had made it his personal mission to torment Marcus about his faith. Each morning, without fail, Kowalski would lean against his truck and call out loud enough for the entire motor pool to hear. "Hey, Washington, you asking your God to make sure the Germans don't shoot straight today?" Kowalski would say, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Maybe you should pray for some common sense instead." The other drivers would chuckle, though some felt uncomfortable with Kowalski's constant harassment. Sergeant Bill Murphy, a 32-year-old career soldier from Boston, generally maintained order in the unit, but had never stepped in to stop the religious mockery. Murphy had served in the Pacific before being transferred to Europe, and his pragmatic approach to survival left little room for what he considered superstitious behavior. "Kowalski's got a point," Murphy would often say during evening discussions around their makeshift camp stove. "Out here, you better trust your rifle and your training, not some book written 2,000 years ago." Private First Class Eddie Chen, whose parents had emigrated from China to San Francisco before he was born, remained neutral in these discussions, but privately admired Marcus's unwavering commitment to his beliefs. Chen had witnessed enough prejudice in his own life to recognize the strength it took for Marcus to maintain his dignity in the face of constant ridicule. Corporal Jake Thompson from rural Tennessee represented the most vocal opposition to Marcus's presence in their unit altogether. Thompson made no secret of his belief that colored soldiers had no business serving alongside white troops, and he frequently complained to anyone who would listen that the military's decision to integrate supply units represented a dangerous social experiment that would get good men hurt. "Mark my words," Thompson would say while cleaning his rifle. "When things get hot, that boy's gonna fold like a house of cards. All that praying ain't gonna help when bullets start flying." Despite the constant harassment, Marcus never responded with anger or defensiveness. Instead, he would simply nod respectfully and continue with his duties, which he performed with meticulous attention to detail that even his critics could not fault. His truck was always the cleanest in the motor pool, his equipment properly maintained, and his delivery schedules met without exception. When other drivers struggled with mechanical problems, Marcus would quietly offer assistance, sharing his considerable mechanical knowledge gained from years of maintaining farm equipment back home. The 561st Transportation Company operated under the command of Captain Robert Mitchell, a career officer from Virginia who ran his unit with military efficiency while largely ignoring the racial tensions that simmered beneath the surface. Mitchell had received the unit as part of the Army's experiment with integrated supply operations, and his primary concern was maintaining the flow of materials to the front lines rather than addressing social issues he considered beyond his authority to resolve. The company's mission was straightforward but vital to the war effort. Each day, convoys of 6 to 8 trucks would depart the depot at dawn, carrying everything from rifle ammunition to medical supplies to hot meals for troops in forward positions. The routes varied depending on tactical requirements, but most runs took the drivers through the rolling hills and dense forests of the Belgian countryside. Following narrow roads that had been carved through the landscape centuries before, mechanized warfare transformed the region. Intelligence reports throughout November had indicated that German resistance in their sector remained minimal. The enemy had been in steady retreat since the Allied breakout from Normandy, and most military planners believed the conflict would conclude before spring arrived. This assessment had led to a relaxation of security protocols for supply convoys, with many drivers carrying only their personal sidearms rather than the heavier weapons typically assigned to combat units. The trucks themselves were standard General Motors 2.5-ton cargo vehicles, known affectionately as deuce and a halves throughout the American military. Each truck could carry approximately 5,000 pounds of supplies, and their 6-cylinder engines provided reliable, if not spectacular, performance over the varied terrain of the European theatre. The vehicles featured 4-wheel drive capability for navigating muddy conditions, though the approaching winter was beginning to present challenges that even their robust design struggled to overcome. Marcus drove truck number 47, a vehicle he had personally maintained since joining the unit in August. The engine ran smoothly thanks to his careful attention to oil changes and filter replacements, and he had painted small crosses on the dashboard as personal reminders of his faith. Other drivers had initially mocked these religious symbols, but their criticism had gradually faded as they recognized the superior performance of Marcus's vehicle compared to their own less carefully maintained trucks. The cargo varied from day to day, but December missions typically included winter clothing, additional blankets, and increased ammunition loads as military planners prepared for potential German counterattacks. Medical supplies had become increasingly important as cases of trench foot and frostbite mounted among troops spending extended periods in the frozen Belgian countryside. Hot meals, prepared in insulated containers at the depot, provided brief moments of comfort for soldiers who had been subsisting on cold rations for weeks at a time. Communications between the depot and forward positions relied on a combination of radio transmissions and written orders carried by the convoy leaders. Radio equipment in 1944 remained bulky and unreliable, particularly in the heavily forested terrain that characterized much of their operational area. Many convoys departed with specific destination coordinates and scheduled return times, but maintained radio silence unless emergency situations arose. The morning of December 15th began like any other, with Marcus kneeling beside his truck in the pre-dawn darkness, his breath visible in the frigid air as he opened his Bible to the Book of Psalms. The temperature had dropped to 14 degrees Fahrenheit overnight, and ice crystals had formed on the metal surfaces of every vehicle in the motor pool. Other drivers wrapped themselves in additional blankets and postponed their morning preparations until the last possible moment. But Marcus maintained his routine regardless of weather conditions. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," Marcus whispered, reading from Psalm 23 as he had done countless mornings before. "He maketh me to lie down in green pastures, he leadeth me beside the still waters." The familiar words provided comfort and strength as he prepared for another day of service, though he could not have known that this particular morning's prayers would prove more crucial than any he had offered before. The scripture reading continued for exactly 20 minutes, as always, before Marcus closed the Bible and secured it in his breast pocket. Sergeant Murphy emerged from the operations tent at precisely 5:45, carrying the day's movement orders and conducting his standard pre-mission briefing. 6 trucks would comprise the morning convoy, carrying a mixed load of rifle ammunition, medical supplies and hot meals to forward positions near the village of Malmedy. The route would take them north through the Ardennes forest, following secondary roads that intelligence reports indicated remained clear of enemy presence. "Weather's going to be rough today," Murphy announced to the assembled drivers, his voice cutting through the morning stillness. "Temperatures dropping and there's snow in the forecast. Keep your intervals tight and watch for ice on the roads." The convoy composition included Marcus driving truck 47 with a load of medical supplies, Kowalski in truck 32 carrying ammunition, Thompson in truck 19 with winter clothing, Chen in truck 41 loaded with rations, and 2 additional drivers, Corporals Frank Romano and Mike Patterson, hauling mixed supplies in trucks 28 and 53 respectively. Romano, a 27-year-old from New York, whose family operated a small trucking business, served as the convoy's assistant leader and navigator. His experience with commercial transportation had proven valuable in managing the complex logistics of military supply operations. Patterson, 22 years old and originally from Oregon, had joined the unit only 2 months earlier, but had quickly established himself as a reliable driver with an intuitive understanding of vehicle maintenance. The loading process began at 6:15, with each driver responsible for securing his cargo, according to military specifications. Wooden crates of ammunition required careful placement to maintain proper weight distribution, while medical supplies needed protection from the extreme cold to prevent damage to sensitive materials. The hot meal containers, insulated with thick layers of cork and canvas, would retain their temperature for approximately 8 hours if properly handled. Marcus approached his loading duties with characteristic thoroughness, checking and double-checking the tie-down straps that secured the medical supply crates. The cargo included morphine for pain management, sulfur powder for wound treatment, and surgical instruments that forward medical teams desperately needed. He understood that any damage to these supplies could directly impact the survival chances of wounded soldiers, and this knowledge motivated him to exercise extra care in his preparations. Other drivers loaded their trucks with varying degrees of attention to detail. Kowalski, still resentful about the early hour and cold weather, secured his ammunition crates with minimal effort and spent more time complaining about the mission than ensuring proper cargo handling. Thompson loaded the winter clothing efficiently, but continued his ongoing commentary about the wisdom of including colored soldiers in military operations. "This is exactly the kind of mission where things go wrong," Thompson muttered to Romano while adjusting his cargo straps. "Mark my words, before this day is over, we're going to be in trouble, and Washington's going to be praying instead of fighting." Romano, who generally avoided racial discussions, focused on his navigation equipment and route planning. The convoy would follow a northward path through the forest, traveling approximately 40 miles to reach their destination near Malmedy. The route had been traveled dozens of times throughout November, without incident, and intelligence reports continued to indicate minimal enemy activity in the region. Chen completed his loading efficiently and used the remaining time to perform additional maintenance checks on his vehicle. His mechanical aptitude had been developed through years of helping his father operate a small garage in San Francisco, and he appreciated Marcus's similar attention to equipment care. The two men rarely spoke due to the social barriers that existed within their segregated unit, but they shared a mutual respect for professional competence. At exactly 7:30, Sergeant Murphy climbed into the lead vehicle and gave the signal for departure. The convoy rolled out of the depot in single file, maintaining approximately 100 yards between vehicles as prescribed by standard operating procedures. The morning sun had not yet risen above the eastern horizon, and the drivers relied on their headlights to navigate the narrow Belgian roads. The first hour of travel proceeded without incident. The roads had been cleared of snow by military engineers, though patches of ice remained treacherous in shaded areas beneath the forest canopy. Marcus maintained steady communication with the vehicle ahead through hand signals, and his truck's reliable engine performance kept him precisely positioned within the convoy formation. Radio chatter remained minimal, with Murphy providing occasional updates on their progress and estimated arrival times. The countryside appeared peaceful in the early morning light, with snow-covered fields stretching between dense patches of forest. Occasional farmhouses dotted the landscape, their chimneys producing thin streams of smoke that indicated civilian populations continuing their daily routines despite the ongoing conflict. As they penetrated deeper into the Ardennes forest, the road narrowed and the trees closed in around them, creating a tunnel-like effect that limited visibility to approximately 50 yards in any direction. Marcus found himself thinking about his family back in Alabama, particularly his mother, who had raised him alone after his father's death in a cotton mill accident when Marcus was 12 years old. She had instilled in him both his strong Christian faith and his unshakable belief in the dignity of all people, regardless of their skin color or circumstances. The convoy's mission was scheduled to conclude by late afternoon, allowing them to return to the depot before darkness fell. December days in Belgium were short, with sunset occurring before 5 o'clock, and military commanders preferred to minimize nighttime travel due to increased risks from both enemy activity and accidents caused by limited visibility. At approximately 9:45 in the morning, as the convoy climbed a gradual hill through a particularly dense section of forest, Marcus felt a sudden uneasiness that he could not rationally explain. The feeling was not based on any observable threat or change in circumstances, but rather represented what he could only describe as divine intuition. He had experienced similar feelings on several occasions throughout his life, always during moments when prayer and careful attention had prevented serious problems. The sensation prompted Marcus to offer a silent prayer for protection and guidance, asking God to watch over his fellow soldiers and to provide wisdom for the decisions that lay ahead. He did not know why this prayer felt more urgent than his usual morning supplications, but his faith had taught him to trust these moments of spiritual insight rather than dismissing them as imagination. Unknown to Marcus and his fellow drivers, German military planners had been preparing a massive counter-offensive operation designed to split Allied forces and recapture the Belgian port of Antwerp. The operation, which history would remember as the Battle of the Bulge, was scheduled to begin with a devastating artillery barrage followed by armored spearhead attacks through precisely the section of the Ardennes forest where the 561st Transportation Company was traveling. More than 200,000 German troops had been secretly assembled in the region, along with nearly 600 tanks and assault guns. The enemy had maintained strict radio silence and moved only during nighttime hours to avoid detection by Allied reconnaissance aircraft. Weather conditions had grounded most Allied air operations for the past week, providing additional cover for the German buildup. The timing of the American supply convoy's movement through the forest was purely coincidental, but it placed them directly in the path of the opening phase of Germany's last major offensive operation of the conflict. Intelligence reports that had indicated minimal enemy presence in the region were about to be proven catastrophically incorrect. At exactly 10:15 in the morning, as Marcus's convoy crested a small hill approximately 15 miles from their destination, the first German artillery shells began falling in the forest around them. The opening barrage was designed to destroy Allied communications equipment and create confusion among forward positions, but several rounds landed close enough to the convoy's route to make the ground shake violently beneath their trucks. Sergeant Murphy immediately ordered the convoy to halt while he attempted to establish radio contact with headquarters. The radio equipment in his lead vehicle crackled with static and intermittent transmissions from other American units reporting similar artillery attacks across a broad front. It quickly became apparent that this was not an isolated incident, but rather the beginning of a major German offensive operation. "This is not good," Murphy muttered into his radio handset, trying to reach the depot headquarters. "Able 7, This is Baker 2-3. We are receiving incoming artillery fire. Repeat, incoming artillery fire. Requesting immediate instructions. The radio response was fragmented and nearly unintelligible due to atmospheric interference and the chaos that was erupting across multiple sectors. Murphy could make out references to German attacks, tank formations, and instructions to avoid certain road networks, but he could not obtain clear guidance about whether to continue forward with their mission or attempt to return to the depot. Marcus climbed down from his truck and approached Sergeant Murphy's position, moving with the calm deliberation that characterized all his actions. Other drivers remained near their vehicles, some checking weapons, while others scanned the tree line for signs of enemy movement. The artillery fire had moved away from their immediate area, but the distant rumble of explosions continued to echo through the forest. "Sergeant, request permission to speak," Marcus said, removing his cap in accordance with military protocol. Murphy looked up from his radio equipment, clearly frustrated by his inability to establish reliable communications. The artillery barrage had intensified in the distance, and several columns of smoke were now visible above the forest canopy to the north and east of their position. "What is it, Washington?" Murphy replied, his usual military formality somewhat relaxed by the stress of their situation. Marcus hesitated for a moment, knowing that his suggestion might be dismissed as superstitious nonsense, but feeling compelled by his spiritual intuition to speak. "Sergeant, I believe we should consider an alternate route back to the depot. Something doesn't feel right about continuing forward." The other drivers had gathered close enough to overhear the conversation, and Kowalski immediately voiced his skepticism. "Oh great, now Washington's getting divine revelations about German strategy. Maybe his God forgot to mention this artillery barrage during morning prayers." Thompson added his own commentary, saying, "I told you this would happen. When things get rough, he starts talking about feelings instead of following orders." Murphy studied his map, considering their limited options. The primary route forward to their destination appeared to be in the general direction of the heaviest artillery fire, while the roads behind them seemed to offer potential escape routes back toward Allied lines. Military doctrine called for supply convoys to avoid combat whenever possible, but abandoning their mission without explicit orders could result in court-martial proceedings. Marcus remained respectfully silent while the sergeant weighed their alternatives, but privately continued his prayers for divine guidance. His spiritual intuition had grown stronger rather than weaker since the artillery barrage began, and he felt certain that continuing forward would lead to disaster for their entire convoy. Chen, who had been listening to the radio chatter from his position near Truck 41, approached the group with additional information. "Sergeant, I'm picking up German voice transmissions on the emergency frequency. Sounds like they have units moving through this entire sector. This intelligence changed the tactical situation significantly. German radio traffic in their operational area indicated enemy ground forces, rather than simply artillery harassment, which meant the convoy faced potential capture or worse if they encountered advancing troops." Murphy made the decision to abandon their original mission and attempt to return to the depot through secondary roads that might avoid the main German advance. "All right, we're turning around," Murphy announced to his drivers. "Romano, get me an alternate route back to base using farm roads and avoid the main highways. Washington, since you seem to have strong feelings about our direction, you take point position. If your instincts are so good, you can lead us home." The assignment was clearly intended as a test of Marcus's conviction rather than a genuine leadership opportunity, but he accepted the responsibility without complaint. Taking point position meant he would be the first to encounter any enemy forces along their route, but it also gave him the opportunity to guide the convoy according to his spiritual guidance. As the drivers prepared to reverse their convoy formation, the sound of tracked vehicles became audible in the forest ahead of them. The distinctive rumbling noise of tank engines and the metallic clanking of steel treads on frozen ground indicated that German armored forces were approaching their position from the north. Murphy's decision to retreat had been made just in time to avoid contact with what appeared to be a significant enemy formation. Marcus took his position at the front of the convoy and began leading them south along a narrow forest road that paralleled their original route, but offered better concealment beneath the dense tree canopy. His prayers intensified as he recognized the gravity of their situation, asking God not only for protection, but for wisdom in choosing the safest path through increasingly dangerous territory. The retreat began at 10:45 in the morning, with Marcus's truck leading 5 other vehicles through winding forest roads that had been designed for agricultural use rather than military traffic. The narrow roadway forced them to reduce speed significantly, but it also provided concealment that might allow them to avoid detection by German reconnaissance elements. Behind them, the sounds of combat grew increasingly intense. Artillery fire was now falling continuously across a broad area, and the distinctive sound of tank guns could be heard echoing through the valleys. Radio transmissions from other American units painted a picture of coordinated German attacks all along the front, with enemy forces advancing rapidly through areas that had been considered secure just hours earlier. Marcus found himself driving more by instinct than by map reading, choosing turns and route changes based on feelings that he could not rationally explain, but had learned to trust throughout his life. At several intersections, he felt compelled to choose paths that seemed less logical from a navigation standpoint, but somehow felt safer from a spiritual perspective. The other drivers, following behind him, began to notice that Marcus's route selections were consistently avoiding areas where German activity subsequently became evident. They could hear tank engines and radio chatter from roads that Marcus had chosen not to take, while their actual route remained clear of enemy presence. Even Kowalski and Thompson began to acknowledge that Washington's navigation was proving remarkably effective. At 11:30 in the morning, as they approached a major crossroads that would determine their ultimate route back to Allied lines, Marcus felt the strongest spiritual guidance he had experienced all day. Every logical consideration suggested they should turn east toward the main highway, which offered the most direct path back to their depot. However, his prayer-inspired intuition urged him to continue south through a series of farm roads that would add several hours to their journey. Marcus stopped his truck and walked back to consult with Sergeant Murphy, knowing that this decision was too important to make without explicit authorization. The choice between routes could determine whether they reached safety or drove directly into German forces, and he wanted to ensure that his spiritual guidance aligned with military judgment. "Sergeant," Marcus said, approaching Murphy's position with his characteristic respectful demeanor, "I strongly recommend we continue south rather than turning east toward the highway." Murphy studied his map, noting that the southern route would take them significantly out of their way and consume precious fuel that might be needed for other purposes. From a purely tactical standpoint, the eastern route appeared safer and more direct. However, he had begun to develop grudging respect for Marcus's instincts after observing their effectiveness throughout the morning's retreat. "What makes you think the southern route is better?" Murphy asked, genuinely curious about Marcus's reasoning. Marcus hesitated, knowing that his honest answer might provoke ridicule from his fellow soldiers. "Sergeant, I can't explain it in military terms, but I have a strong feeling that the eastern route is dangerous. I've been praying for guidance all morning, and everything inside me says we need to go south." Kowalski, who had been listening to the conversation, couldn't resist making another sarcastic comment. "Oh, wonderful. Now we're navigating by prayer instead of maps. This keeps getting better and better." However, Romano, who had been monitoring radio traffic, provided supporting information that changed the discussion significantly. "Sergeant, I'm hearing reports of German armor on Highway N32, which is exactly where the eastern route would take us." This intelligence report aligned with Marcus's spiritual guidance in a way that surprised everyone present, including Marcus himself. The radio confirmation that German forces occupied their planned route provided rational justification for following the southern path that prayer had indicated. Chen added his own observation, saying, "Washington's been right about every turn we've made so far today. Maybe we should trust his judgment." Thompson remained skeptical, but acknowledged the practical results they had observed. "I don't care if he's getting his directions from angels or lucky guesses, as long as they keep us away from German tanks." Murphy made the decision to follow the southern route, though he remained privately skeptical about divine guidance in military operations. His primary concern was getting his men back to Allied lines safely, and Marcus's track record throughout the morning suggested that his navigation choices were consistently effective regardless of their inspiration. The convoy continued south through increasingly rural territory, traveling on roads that were barely wide enough for their trucks and had clearly not been designed for heavy military vehicles. The route took them through small farming communities, where Belgian civilians watched their passage with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Many of these rural residents had lived through German occupation and were understandably nervous about any military activity in their area. As they traveled deeper into the countryside, Marcus found himself reflecting on the morning's events and the way his faith had provided guidance in their time of danger. He had always believed in the power of prayer, but the correlation between his spiritual intuition and the tactical situation was more direct than anything he had experienced before. The thought occurred to him that God might be using him as an instrument to protect his fellow soldiers, even those who had consistently mocked his religious devotion. The afternoon brought additional challenges as fuel levels in several trucks began running low. The extended detour through rural roads was consuming more gasoline than planned, and Murphy realized they would need to locate additional fuel or risk being stranded in territory that might be overrun by German forces. The situation was complicated by the fact that most Allied fuel depots were located along major highways that German forces appeared to be targeting. At 2:15 in the afternoon, as they approached another critical decision point, Marcus felt another strong spiritual impression regarding their route. A small road branched off to the west, leading toward what his map indicated was a tiny village called Stoumont. Logic suggested they should continue south toward larger communities where military fuel supplies might be available, but his prayer-inspired guidance urged him toward the smaller settlement. Once again, Marcus requested permission to speak with Sergeant Murphy about the route selection. He approached the conversation with even greater confidence than before, having witnessed throughout the day how spiritual guidance had consistently aligned with tactical advantages. "Sergeant," Marcus said, "I believe we should take the western road towards Stoumont, even though it appears to be another detour." Murphy was beginning to develop genuine faith in Marcus's navigation abilities, though he remained unable to explain their effectiveness through conventional military analysis. The morning's experiences had demonstrated that Washington's route choices were consistently successful in avoiding German forces, regardless of whether they could be justified through standard tactical reasoning. "What's your thinking, Washington?" Murphy asked, using a tone that indicated respect for Marcus's judgment rather than skepticism about his methods. Marcus chose to be completely honest about his decision-making process, knowing that transparency would be important for maintaining the trust he had begun to develop with his fellow soldiers. "Sergeant, I've been praying about each route decision, and I feel strongly guided towards Stoumont. I can't give you tactical reasons, but my faith tells me this is the right direction." The other drivers had been listening to this exchange, and their attitudes toward Marcus's spiritual guidance had evolved significantly throughout the day. Even Kowalski, who had spent months mocking Washington's religious devotion, found himself hoping that the prayers would continue to provide effective navigation. "At this point," Kowalski said, "I'm willing to try anything that keeps us away from German guns. If Washington's prayers have been working all day, maybe we should keep following them." Thompson nodded agreement, saying, "I still don't understand how it works, but I can't argue with the results we've been getting." Romano provided additional practical support for the western route by noting that smaller villages were more likely to have hidden fuel caches that hadn't been discovered by either German or Allied forces. Rural communities often maintained emergency supplies for their own use, and they might be willing to share resources with American soldiers who were clearly in retreat rather than advance. The decision was made to follow Marcus's guidance towards Stoumont, though the detour would add significant distance to their journey and further deplete their fuel reserves. However, the pattern established throughout the day suggested that routes chosen through prayer were consistently safer than alternatives selected through conventional military logic. The road to Stoumont proved to be the most challenging driving of the entire day, with steep grades and sharp turns that required careful navigation to avoid mechanical damage to their heavily loaded trucks. Marcus drove with exceptional skill, using techniques he had learned during years of operating farm equipment on difficult terrain in rural Alabama. His vehicle maintained steady progress despite the challenging conditions, and the convoy behind him was able to follow his lead without incident. As they crested a hill overlooking the village of Stoumont, at approximately 3:30 in the afternoon, Marcus felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the divine protection that had guided them throughout the day. The village appeared peaceful, with no signs of German military presence, and several columns of smoke rising from chimneys indicated active civilian population. However, the most remarkable discovery awaited them at the bottom of the hill, where a small American military outpost had been established to monitor German activity in the region. The outpost consisted of approximately 20 soldiers from the 82nd Airborne Division who had been conducting reconnaissance missions but found themselves cut off by the German offensive that morning. Staff Sergeant Michael O'Brien, the senior non-commissioned officer at the outpost, greeted the convoy with relief and amazement. His unit had been monitoring German radio traffic all day and was well aware of the massive enemy offensive that was overrunning American positions throughout the Ardennes region. "You men are incredibly lucky to be alive," O'Brien told Sergeant Murphy as the convoy pulled into the outpost perimeter. "German armored spearheads have been advancing all day along every major road in this sector. How did you manage to avoid them?" Murphy found himself in the unusual position of crediting divine guidance for their survival, something that would have seemed impossible when the day began. "We had some unconventional navigation assistance," Murphy replied, glancing toward Marcus with newfound respect. O'Brien's unit provided crucial intelligence about German positions that confirmed how narrowly the convoy had avoided disaster throughout their retreat. Every alternate route that conventional military logic would have suggested had been compromised by enemy forces, while the prayer-guided path had somehow threaded between advancing German columns without detection. The airborne soldiers also provided the fuel supplies that the convoy desperately needed to complete their journey back to Allied lines. Their outpost maintained emergency fuel stores for reconnaissance vehicles, and O'Brien was willing to share these resources with fellow American soldiers who clearly needed assistance. More importantly, O'Brien's unit had maintained radio contact with Allied headquarters and could provide updated intelligence about safe routes back to American positions. The German offensive had created a fluid tactical situation where traditional supply routes were no longer viable, but the airborne soldiers had identified several farm roads that remained under Allied control. As the convoy prepared to continue their journey with this additional guidance and support, Marcus took a moment to express his gratitude through silent prayer. The day's experiences had demonstrated God's protection in ways that were impossible to dismiss as coincidence, and he felt humbled by the responsibility of having served as an instrument of divine guidance for his fellow soldiers. The other drivers approached Marcus individually to acknowledge the role his faith had played in their survival. Kowalski, who had spent months mocking Washington's religious devotion, was the first to speak. "Washington, I owe you an apology," Kowalski said, his usual sarcasm replaced by genuine humility. "I don't understand how your prayers work, but they saved our lives today. I won't make fun of your faith anymore." Thompson, whose racial prejudices had made him particularly hostile toward Marcus, struggled to find words that could adequately express his changed perspective. "I was wrong about a lot of things," Thompson said quietly. "Your character has nothing to do with your skin color, and your faith is something I need to respect rather than mock." Chen, who had always maintained a more respectful attitude toward Marcus, took the opportunity to express his admiration for Washington's courage in following spiritual guidance, even when it contradicted conventional wisdom. "You had the strength to trust your beliefs when lives depended on it," Chen said. "That takes more courage than I think I could manage." Romano and Patterson added their own expressions of gratitude and respect, acknowledging that Marcus's spiritual guidance had consistently proven more effective than traditional military navigation throughout their retreat. Both men admitted that they had begun praying themselves during the most dangerous portions of their journey, asking God to continue providing protection through Marcus's faith. Sergeant Murphy found himself in the most difficult position, as military protocol did not provide guidelines for crediting divine intervention in after-action reports. However, he could not deny that Marcus's unconventional navigation had saved every man in the convoy from capture or worse. Murphy made a personal decision to recommend Marcus for military recognition, though he would need to find secular language to describe spiritual guidance in his official reports. "Washington," Murphy said, "I don't know how to explain what happened today in military terms, but I know that your leadership saved this convoy. I'm going to make sure that gets recognized in your service record." The continuation of their journey back to Allied lines proved far less eventful than their morning retreat, thanks to the intelligence provided by O'Brien's airborne unit and the fuel supplies that would allow them to complete their travel without additional stops. However, the experience had fundamentally changed the relationships within the 561st Transportation Company. As they drove through the early December darkness, following roads that would take them back to American positions, each driver found himself reflecting on the day's events and their implications. The correlation between Marcus's prayers and their survival had been too consistent and too dramatic to dismiss as mere coincidence, and this recognition forced them to reconsider assumptions they had held about faith, race, and the nature of divine intervention. Marcus himself drove in contemplative silence, overwhelmed by the responsibility that had been placed upon him, and grateful for the way God had used him to protect his fellow soldiers. The experience had strengthened his own faith, while demonstrating to skeptics that spiritual guidance could provide practical benefits even in military situations. He understood that the day's events represented not just personal vindication, but an opportunity to bridge racial and religious divisions that had previously separated him from his fellow soldiers. The convoy reached Allied lines at approximately 8:30 in the evening, passing through checkpoints manned by military police who were astonished to learn that supply vehicles had successfully navigated through territory now known to be occupied by German forces. Word of their survival spread quickly through military communications networks, and their story began attracting attention from intelligence officers who wanted to understand how they had avoided capture. When they finally arrived back at their depot near Liège, Captain Mitchell was waiting to debrief the convoy personally. Initial reports about the German offensive had suggested that any Allied forces caught in the Ardennes region would likely be overrun, and Mitchell had begun preparing casualty reports for his missing drivers. The safe return of the entire convoy represented not just personal relief, but military intelligence that could prove valuable for understanding German tactics and capabilities. "Sergeant Murphy," Captain Mitchell said as the convoy pulled into the motor pool, "I want a complete report on your route and timeline. Intelligence wants to know how you avoided German forces that apparently overran your entire sector." Murphy found himself facing the challenge of explaining spiritual guidance in terms that military officials would find acceptable. However, the practical results spoke for themselves, and he decided to present an honest account of Marcus's role in their survival, while allowing his superiors to interpret the information according to their own understanding. The debriefing session lasted several hours, with intelligence officers mapping the convoy's route and comparing it against reports of German positions throughout the day. The correlation between areas that Marcus had felt guided to avoid and locations where German forces were subsequently confirmed became increasingly obvious as the analysis progressed. Colonel James Harrison, the senior intelligence officer conducting the debriefing, found himself unable to explain the convoy's successful navigation through conventional military analysis. Every decision that had saved the convoy appeared to contradict standard tactical doctrine, yet the results had been consistently effective in avoiding enemy contact. "Sergeant Murphy," Colonel Harrison said, "your route selections were tactically unsound by every measure we use for evaluating military decisions, but they were obviously effective in practice. How did you choose these particular roads?" Murphy decided that honesty would serve better than attempting to fabricate conventional explanations for unconventional guidance. "Sir, Corporal Washington provided navigation advice based on his religious faith, and his recommendations proved accurate throughout our retreat." The colonel's response reflected the practical military mindset that prioritized results over methodology. "I don't care if he was reading tea leaves or consulting fortune cookies, as long as he kept American soldiers alive. Washington's navigation probably saved 6 American lives and preserved valuable military equipment that we can't afford to lose." This official recognition of Marcus's contribution represented a significant moment for the entire 561st Transportation Company. For the first time since joining the unit, Marcus received formal acknowledgement of his value as a soldier and leader, recognition that transcended racial barriers and religious differences. The aftermath of December 15th, 1944, brought lasting changes to the relationships within the transportation company. The shared experience of surviving against overwhelming odds through divine guidance had created bonds between soldiers who had previously been separated by prejudice and skepticism. Marcus found himself accepted as a leader rather than tolerated as an outsider, while his fellow drivers developed new respect for both his character and his faith. Kowalski, who had been the most vocal critic of Marcus's religious devotion, underwent the most dramatic transformation. He began attending the informal prayer sessions that Marcus held each evening, initially out of gratitude for their survival, but gradually developing his own relationship with faith. The experience had demonstrated to Kowalski that spiritual beliefs could provide practical benefits rather than representing mere superstition. Thompson's change was more gradual but equally significant. His racial prejudices, reinforced by years of cultural conditioning, could not be entirely overcome by a single day's experience. However, he found it impossible to continue viewing Marcus as inferior after witnessing the courage and wisdom that had saved their lives. Thompson began treating Marcus with the respect due to a fellow soldier rather than the hostility he had previously displayed. Chen, Romano, and Patterson had been less resistant to Marcus's character from the beginning, but even they found their understanding of faith and divine guidance expanded by their shared experience. All three men began incorporating prayer into their daily routines, asking for protection and guidance in their continuing military service. Sergeant Murphy faced the challenge of reconciling his pragmatic military worldview with the undeniable evidence of divine intervention he had witnessed. While he remained unable to fully embrace Marcus's religious perspective, he developed profound respect for the practical effectiveness of spiritual guidance when applied by a person of genuine faith. Captain Mitchell, upon reviewing the intelligence reports and survivor testimonies, made the official decision to recommend Marcus for the Bronze Star Medal, recognizing his role in saving American lives and preserving military equipment. The recommendation emphasized Marcus's courage in taking point position during their retreat and his exceptional navigation skills that had avoided enemy contact throughout the day. The Bronze Star recommendation faced administrative challenges due to the unconventional nature of Marcus's guidance, but the practical results could not be disputed. Military officials ultimately focused on the objective outcomes rather than the subjective methods, allowing Marcus to receive recognition for his service without requiring official endorsement of divine intervention. The story of the 561st Transportation Company's survival spread throughout the American forces in Europe, providing inspiration for soldiers facing the desperate conditions of the Battle of the Bulge. The German offensive ultimately failed, but not before creating weeks of intense combat that tested the resolve of every Allied unit in the theater. Marcus continued serving with the Transportation Company until the end of the conflict in Europe, maintaining his daily prayer routine and providing spiritual guidance for his fellow soldiers whenever situations required unconventional wisdom. His reputation for reliable navigation and strong character made him one of the most respected soldiers in the company, and his influence extended far beyond his official rank. After the conflict ended, Marcus returned to Alabama, where he used his military experience and mechanical skills to establish a successful automotive repair business. He remained active in his local church throughout his life, often speaking about the way faith had provided guidance during his most challenging moments in military service. His story became part of the oral tradition within his community, inspiring subsequent generations to maintain strong religious devotion even in the face of skepticism or persecution. Kowalski returned to Detroit, where he worked in the automotive industry alongside his father, but maintained the religious faith that had developed during his military service. He frequently shared the story of December 15, 1944, with his family and friends, always emphasizing the way Marcus's prayers had saved their lives when conventional military wisdom would have led them into disaster. Thompson struggled with reconciling his changed perspective on race with the cultural expectations of his Tennessee community, But his military experience had made it impossible for him to maintain his previous prejudices. He became an advocate for civil rights within his local community, often telling the story of Marcus's courage and faith as evidence that character transcended racial boundaries. Chen used his military experience to expand his family's automotive business in San Francisco, eventually becoming a successful entrepreneur who employed workers from diverse backgrounds. He maintained lifelong respect for both Marcus's character and the power of religious faith to provide guidance in difficult circumstances. Romano and Patterson both pursued careers in transportation after their military service, with Romano expanding his family's trucking business and Patterson establishing a commercial driving school in Oregon. Both men credited their military experience with Marcus for teaching them the importance of character and faith in leadership positions. Sergeant Murphy completed his military career as a career soldier, eventually achieving the rank of Master Sergeant before retiring after 25 years of service. He never fully embraced religious faith himself, but developed lasting respect for soldiers who maintained strong spiritual convictions. His military reports consistently emphasized the importance of character and moral courage in military leadership. Captain Mitchell continued commanding transportation units throughout the remainder of the conflict and into the post-war period. His experience with the 561st Transportation Company influenced his approach to racial integration within military units, and he became an advocate for judging soldiers based on their performance rather than their background. The broader implications of December 15, 1944, extended beyond the personal transformations experienced by individual soldiers. The story demonstrated that divine guidance could provide practical benefits in military situations, challenging conventional assumptions about the relationship between faith and effective leadership. Military historians studying the Battle of the Bulge would later note that numerous small units survived against overwhelming odds through decisions that contradicted standard tactical doctrine, suggesting that unconventional wisdom sometimes proved more effective than established military procedures. The 561st Transportation Company's survival also contributed to the growing recognition within the American military that racial integration could produce positive results, rather than the discipline problems that many commanders had anticipated. Marcus's leadership during their retreat provided evidence that character and competence were more important than skin color in determining military effectiveness. The religious aspects of the story resonated with the American home front, where families were seeking evidence that divine protection was available for their loved ones serving overseas. Stories of faith-based guidance and miraculous survival provided comfort for civilian populations who were struggling with uncertainty about the conflict's outcome and the safety of American forces. Military chaplains throughout the European theater began incorporating the Transportation Company's story into their services, emphasizing the practical benefits of maintaining strong faith even in combat situations. The narrative provided concrete evidence that prayer and spiritual devotion could produce tangible results rather than merely offering psychological comfort. The story's impact on racial attitudes within the military was gradual but significant. Other transportation companies and support units began evaluating their own racial policies, with some commanders recognizing that integration might provide tactical advantages rather than social problems. Marcus's example demonstrated that colored soldiers could provide leadership in crisis situations, challenging stereotypes that had limited their opportunities for advancement. As the conflict in Europe concluded and American forces began the process of demobilization, the lessons learned from December 15, 1944, continued influencing military policy and social attitudes. The experience had demonstrated that faith, character, and competence transcended racial boundaries, providing a foundation for the civil rights advances that would follow in subsequent decades. The Transportation Company's reunion, held in 1947, brought together all the surviving members to commemorate their shared experience and to honor Marcus's role in their survival. The gathering provided an opportunity for the men to reflect on how that single day had changed their perspectives on faith, race, and the nature of divine intervention in human affairs. Marcus used the reunion as an opportunity to emphasize that divine guidance was available to anyone who sought it with genuine faith, rather than representing a special gift reserved for particular individuals. He encouraged his fellow veterans to maintain their spiritual development and to share their story with others who might benefit from understanding the practical power of religious devotion. The reunion also provided closure for relationships that had been transformed by their shared experience. Former antagonists were able to express gratitude and respect that had been impossible to articulate during the immediate aftermath of their survival. The gathering demonstrated that the bonds forged through divine intervention and mutual dependence had lasted long beyond their military service. In the years that followed, members of the 561st Transportation Company remained in contact through letters and occasional visits, maintaining the relationships that had been fundamentally changed by their experience in the Ardennes forest. Their correspondence often included references to continued faith development and the ongoing influence of December 15, 1944, on their civilian lives. Marcus's influence extended beyond his immediate military unit, as his story spread throughout veteran organizations and religious communities. His example encouraged other veterans to share their own experiences of divine guidance during combat situations, creating a body of testimony that challenged secular assumptions about the relationship between faith and military effectiveness. The historical significance of the transportation company's survival became more apparent as military historians gained access to German operational records after the conflict's conclusion. The enemy documents revealed how closely the American convoy had come to capture or destruction, confirming that their survival had required guidance that transcended conventional military planning. German commanders had anticipated that Allied supply units would be easily overrun during the opening phases of their offensive, and they had allocated minimal resources for dealing with isolated American convoys. The failure to capture units like the 561st Transportation Company contributed to logistical problems that ultimately hampered the German advance and contributed to the offensive's eventual failure. The correlation between Marcus's prayer-guided navigation and the specific deployment patterns of German forces created a compelling case study for military chaplains and religious scholars interested in documenting divine intervention in warfare. The precision with which spiritual guidance had avoided enemy positions suggested purpose rather than coincidence, providing evidence for those who believed in active divine protection for righteous causes. Marcus's later civilian career as an automotive repair shop owner provided him with opportunities to continue demonstrating the character traits that had made him an effective military leader. His business success was built on the same attention to detail and commitment to service that had characterized his military performance, and his shop became known for honest dealing and reliable work that reflected his Christian values. The integration of his business in 1950s Alabama required the same moral courage that Marcus had displayed during his military service. His reputation for competence and character gradually overcame racial barriers, and his shop served customers from all backgrounds who recognized that quality work transcended social prejudices. Marcus's involvement in civil rights activities was motivated by his military experience and his understanding that character rather than race determined individual worth. He participated in voter registration drives and peaceful protests, always emphasizing the importance of maintaining dignity and faith even when facing hostility and persecution. His story from December 15, 1944, became part of the narrative used by civil rights activists to demonstrate that colored Americans had served their country with honor and distinction during the conflict. The recognition he had received for his military service provided evidence that integration could produce positive results in civilian society as well as military organizations. The religious aspects of Marcus's story continued influencing American Christianity long after the conflict ended. His experience demonstrated that faith could provide practical guidance rather than merely offering emotional comfort, encouraging believers to seek divine direction in their daily decisions and challenges. Churches throughout the American South incorporated Marcus's story into their teachings about the power of persistent prayer and the importance of maintaining faith even when facing ridicule or persecution. His example provided inspiration for believers who were struggling with their own challenges and needed evidence that divine guidance was available to ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. The broader impact of the 561st Transportation Company's story on American society reflected the nation's evolving understanding of race, faith, and military service. The experience had demonstrated that patriotism and competence existed within all racial groups, challenging assumptions that had limited opportunities for colored Americans in both military and civilian contexts. As America entered the post-war era, the lessons learned from December 15, 1944, contributed to the social changes that would transform the nation over subsequent decades. The story provided evidence that integration could strengthen rather than weaken American institutions, and that faith-based leadership could produce practical benefits in crisis situations. The legacy of Marcus Washington's service extended far beyond his individual recognition to influence military policy, social attitudes, and religious understanding throughout American society. His example demonstrated that character, faith, and competence were the true measures of worth, regardless of racial background or social circumstances. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.